We're studying in Joshua, the 18th chapter. And if you'll remember last week, um, we basically talked about the boundaries of Benjamin right up in here. And to just kind of summarize it, it's got Judah to the south, it's got Ephraim to the north, and then it's got the Jordan River over to the east. And that's kind of the boundaries. And of course, you can see here that Benjamin doesn't have a very big allotment, but obviously it was sufficient in God's eyes, and that's what they drew. So today we're going to start with verse 21, and I'm going to make a command decision here that I am not going to read all the names of those cities. So if you want to know what they are, you can read them in your Bible there, and I'm just going to make some comments about the cities there as we go along, and then we'll get into the 19th chapter and divide the promised land up a little bit more. Before we go any further, I'd like for Pete Peters, if he would, to lead our minds in prayer.
Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day, for the opportunity we have to be here this morning. We ask that you be with us, be with our hearts and our minds as we study your word. Be with all the teachers as they have prepared their lessons, help them to share what they have, and us to be receptive to those things. These things we ask in your Son's name. Amen.
Okay, so basically, not only when they got the territory, but they also inherited some cities. So if you break down these verses 21 through 28, it basically breaks the towns down into two groups. There were 12 towns that stood on the eastern part of the territory, which is verses 21 through 24. And then there's 14 on the west side, which is verses 25 through 28. Now, the eastern group included two other towns, Asheroth and Almon, and this is talked about in Joshua 21 and 18, and these two cities were actually given up by Benjamin to the Levites. And if you'll remember, the Levites didn't get any inheritance in the promised land, but they were allotted cities in each one of the groups for them to basically have their home and to perform the things that they need to do. It's also interesting to note that this Anthroth was the home of the prophet Jeremiah. We can read about that in Jeremiah 1:1 and Jeremiah 11:21. And it was one of the areas that was still inhabited by the Benjamites after the captivity. And this is discussed in Nehemiah, the 11th chapter. It actually starts in verse 30, but 32 actually mentions this particular town. And this particular village does exist today. It's called Anta, A-N-A-T-A. And in that city, there's a lot of the ruins of the ancient city that's there. And this particular town is about an hour and a quarter north of Jerusalem. And the other interesting city that's in this particular group is Zelah. And it's the burial place of Saul and his family. And this is discussed in 2 Samuel 21 and 14. But they really don't know exactly where this city is. They've not really been able to locate it. And then Mizpah, or also known as Mizpah, is where the war with Benjamin was decided, and this is talked about in Judges 20, chapters 20 and 21. This is also where Samuel judged the people, and also where Saul was chosen as king. And this is discussed in 1 Samuel 7 and 5, and also we talked about it a little bit back in the 10th chapter of Joshua. And later on in history, it was also a seat of the Babylonian governor Gishta. So a pretty interesting area here that was allocated to Benjamin, and it had some historical significance to the area and to the grand scheme of things. Any questions or comments about those verses? All right, let's move on to to chapter 19. So here in chapter 19, in the first 9 verses, we're going to talk about the inheritance of Simeon. And Lot was drawn after Judah's, Joseph's, and Benjamin, because Jacob had put the tribe under disgrace, yet it is, put before the 2 younger sons of Leah and the 3 sons of the handmaids. And it's kind of interesting to note that if you look at Jewish history, there's nobody that really is significant that came out of this tribe. There wasn't any prophets or any great leader or anything. They were just kind of there. And if you look at what they inherited and you look at their history, it wasn't really a tribe meant for greatness. So let's look at the first verse here. It says, "And the second lot came forth to Simeon for the tribe of the sons of Simeon according to their families, and their inheritance was inside the inheritance of the sons of Judah." So we can see here on the map, Judah had a really big allotment of land, and we see Simeon right here, kind of in the middle of Judah, and it was surrounded on all sides by the tribe of Judah. Now, obviously, we see again the appointment of the providence of God in this particular selection area and in this drawing. Because if we go back to Genesis, the 34th chapter, verses 25 through 31, Simeon and Levi massacred the innocent Shedemites. And Jacob had foretold that when the land was divided, that they would be scattered and they would be divided among the people. And this is talked about in Genesis 34 and 25. If you want to read that account, it goes into some pretty pretty graphic details and quite a bit of details to Jacob's thinking on this. It said the son in the 27th verse, it says, "The sons of Jacob come upon the slain and plundered the city because they had defiled their sister. And they took their sheep and their oxen and their asses and that which was in the city, which was in the field, and all their wealth and all their little ones and their wives, and took captive and plundered even all that was in the house. And Jacob said to Simeon and Levi, You have troubled me to make me stink among those who live in the land, among the Canaanites, the Perizzites, and being a few in number, they shall gather themselves together against me and kill me, and I shall be destroyed, my house and I. And they said, should be deal with your sister as a harlot." So basically, Jacob was not happy with the things that they had done, and it was going to come back to haunt him. So basically, in Genesis 49 and 7, it says, "Let their anger be cursed, for it was fierce, and their wrath, for it was cruel. I will divide them in Jacob and scatter them in Israel." So this was prophesied that when they got to the promised land, this was what was going to happen because of things that had happened in the past. So we see here that this prophecy that was made back in Genesis was literally fulfilled in the manner in which that God dispersed these two tribes. The Levites, they were scattered all the way through Palestine because they had no inheritance at all. And then we see here that Simeon, they were dispersed in Judah, and Judah was pretty much there for their protection and to let them be kind of under the control of somebody else, because as though they were a group that couldn't be controlled very well. And we see the providence of God in the choosing of this particular land. Comments about that verse? Okay, the next set of verses, again, there's a whole bunch of geography here, and we're going to talk about the boundaries of the land that we see here on the map. So starting with verse 2, it says, "And they had their inheritance Beersheba and Sheba and Maladah and Halashah, Bala and Azim and Atalah." Forget all that stuff. Let's move on down here to let's move on down here to verse 8, and it talks about all the villages that were around the cities to the south, and this was basically the inheritance that they've got. And then the inheritance was in verse 9. It says the inheritance of the sons of Simeon was out of proportion of the sons of Judah, for the part of the sons of Judah was too much for them. Therefore, the sons of Simeon had their inheritance within their inheritance. So, it was the providence of God that Judah had more land than what they really needed or what they could take care of. So to kind of rectify that situation, we see here that the inheritance of Simeon fell within this inheritance, and it was a lot of them at Gilead, and there was just too much there for for Judah to take care of. So we see here that God set this plan into motion long before these things actually came into existence. Comments about those verses? Okay, now we're going to talk about the existence of Zebulun, and this is in verses 10 through 16. And I think this is a pretty interesting section, and there's a lot written in the scholars about this particular section of the division, and we'll hopefully you'll find this kind of interesting. So let's start with verse 10. And it says, "And the third lot came upon for the sons of Zebulun according to their families, and the borders of their inheritance was to Sarid. And their border went toward the sea, and Mesalar, and reached Debuseth, and reached the river that is before Jorkum, and turned from Sared eastward toward the sunrise to the border of the flames of Tabor, and then goes out to Dabaroth and goes to Joppa. And from there it passes on along the east of Jephahepher and Ekekazim, going to Redem to Nea. And the border compasses it to the north side of Hethrom, and it edges in the valley of Jezreel, and Ketha, and Niphil, and Siram, and Azla, and Bethlehem, 12 cities in their villages. And this is the inheritance of Zebulun according to their families and their cities." So what we're talking about is this area up in here is where we're talking about. So Zebulun's territory lay north of the plain of Jezreel that marked Manasseh's northern border and the southwest hills of Naphtali. And the northwest, its neighbors, was Asher, and on the southeast was Issachar. So this land that they inherited was very fertile land, really good land for farming. And the identification of the towns and villages there were 18 proper names in the verse. So you would think that through all of these 18 names and all of these cities that were given here, it would be very easy to outline exactly what the border was that Zebulun inherited. However, the problem that the scholars have had, and I mean the scholars are all over the place on this, and so are the geographers and everybody else, they can't identify where these towns are. They haven't been able to find the ruins or anything like that. So these maps that they're putting together on Zebulun is kind of speculation, and it's been very difficult to put the map exactly the way that it needs to be. And in spite of that, all these modern scholars and archaeologists and geographers, they have investigated trying to pinpoint these sites, but there's actually no consensus among any of them about where they are, because they can't find any semblance of these particular cities. But here's kind of the interesting thing about it. if you look at just about every map that you're going to see, they're landlocked. But that doesn't jive with some of the things that the Bible said. So if we're guided by the listings in Joshua 19 and using the locations where they assume that these towns were, it makes it pretty reasonable to see that these towns or this particular inheritance is landlocked. And for decades, has been consistency among the geographers of where they draw these borders based on based on consensus. But practically all of the atlases, include Zebulon, show it to be landlocked. Now, if you go back to Genesis, the 49th chapter, verse 13, it says, Zebulun shall live at the seashore, and he shall be a haven for ships on his border side Sidon. Okay, so how can it be like that, and what's prophesied and talked about in Genesis, if it's landlocked? There's not going to be a situation where you're going to be able to be a haven for ships and leave on the seashore if you're landlocked. Now, in Deuteronomy 33, verses 18 and 19, it says, and Zebulon, he said, rejoice, Zebulon, in your going out, and Issachar in your tents. They shall call the peoples to the mountains, and there shall offer sacrifices of righteousness, for they shall suck the bounty of the seas and treasures hidden in the sand. So it's talking about here that part of Zebulon's treasure is going to be in the seas. And it's also kind of interesting to note, and I want to say this before I forget it because I don't have it in my notes. All of the different tribes had like banners or flags. And in the tribe of Zebulun's flag, it had a ship in it. And again, it goes back to, what's the deal here? So it would be kind of easy to dismiss these prophecies because they were, 100 years or so. This happened in the future, but there's also some more problems with these maps that we're looking at. But in the land of Jacob and Moses projected that the other tribes appears to be right on the mark. So why would all of the tribes line up on these maps exactly the way they're supposed to be, except for one tribe? God doesn't do anything halfway. Everything that he does has a plan, and it's supposed to be worked. So, there's something wrong here with the maps, and maybe there's some reason that these towns aren't revealed to us so that we can get a good interpretation of the map. Now, to further make the things a little bit more interesting, Josephus in his writings actually has some writings about the tribe of Zebulun. And I'm going to read you what is. This is a quote right out of Josephus, and it said, the tribe of Zebulun's lot included the land which lays as far as the Sea of Galilee, and that which belonged to Carmel and the Mediterranean Sea. And this is in Josephus 131-2 in his Antiquities book. Now you got to think about this. Josephus was a leader of the Jewish forces in Galilee that fought against the Romans in the first Jewish war, 66 to 73 AD. So he fought in this area, and he knew this area very well. So, he was up on the land that he was defending it. So if they were landlocked, and how could these things that he was saying, he alludes to these bodies of water as being borders of the tribe. So either Josephus has got it wrong and the Bible's got it wrong, or the geographers have got it wrong. Now, to further complicate things even more, in Matthew in the New Testament, he has some things to say about this also. So he implies that Zebulun bordered the Sea of Galilee, which goes right back to the things that Josephus said in his writings. So in Matthew 4:12 through 15, It says, "But when Jesus heard that John was thrown into prison, he went back into Galilee, and leaving Nazareth, he came and lived in Capernaum, which is on the sea coast in the borders of Zebulun and Nephtali, so it might be fulfilled which was spoken by Isaiah the prophet, saying, the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, by the way of the sea beyond Jordan, Galilee of the nations." So here again in Matthew's writing, it refers to the borders here being on the sea. In Matthew 9 and 2, he also kind of refers to it makes a wait a minute. What he's referring to here is Isaiah 9 and 2 is the prophecy. And also the Jewish tradition also supports the implication that Zebulun was a maritime type of tribe. So, you can draw whatever conclusion that you want to draw, but the conclusion that I've drawn is that probably the maps are a little messed up here in this situation, because they haven't been able to properly identify the boundaries there. So I thought that was pretty interesting, and there was a lot more that was written about this, but that's kind of the Clef Note version of all the things that are written. Any comments about those verses? Okay, let's look now at Issachar, verses 17 through 23. "The fourth lot came out to Issachar, the sons of Issachar, according to their families, and their border was toward Jezreel and Chesulloth and Shurim," and a whole bunch of other names that go on down through there. And the area that we're talking about is up in here. And the writer does not give the boundaries of Issachar in as much detail as the preceding tribes. So basically, what we have here is we've got the Jordan River on the east, and it's the border of Maseta to the south, and then you got Zebulun on the northwest and Naphtali on the north of its territories. So instead of describing the boundaries of the tribe, the historian or whoever the author here, he lists the principal cities, and these cities are all on the eastern part of the plain of Escalon. And Issachar received, for the most part, the large and very fertile plain of Jezreel. Now, this is also we talked about a little bit back in Joshua 17 and 16, and it was bound on the south by Manasseh, and on the west by Manasseh and Asher, and the north by Zebulun, and further east by Naphtali, also on the east of the Jordan. Now, Tabor is not the mountain of that name that's discussed in this group of cities, but it was a town that was on the mountain, and this particular town was given to the Levites, though not by Asher, but by Zebulun. And this was a very fortified city, and it played a very key part in the Jewish wars. And Josephus talks about this a little bit in his writings. It's also kind of interesting to note that even to this day, there still remains of the old walls and ruins of the arches and houses and things along that line. And it can be seen up on Mount Tabor and around the summit, that you can see the foundations of the buildings, and you can see also it noted that these were fluted stones. So there was these were stonemasons who built these walls, and very skilled type of people. So we see here that Issachar received basically 16 towns in their inheritance in verses 18 through 22. Comments about those verses. Okay, so now let's get into the inheritance of Asher, which is verses 24 through 31. "And the fifth lot came out of the tribes of the son of Asher, and according to their families." And there's a whole bunch of borders and a whole bunch of names there that we will discuss, and we won't discuss. But basically, here's the area that we're talking about right up in here. A very very good area. We've got got a good border there on the Mediterranean Sea. So Asher's territory stretched along the Mediterranean coastline from where Carmel range of mountains meets the plain of Sharon northward and the northern border of Canaan. Now, also, we've got to note here that the Philistines, were kind of in some of this area. Also, they had borders on the sea there also. So Asher's neighbors to the southeast was Zebulun, and on the east it was Naphtali. And the writer mentions 22 towns, but only records the name of a few of them here in verse 30. So he outlines the area by geography, and then he names a couple of the towns. It's also interesting to note that Mishriel was assigned to the Levites, and this is discussed in Joshua 21 and 30, and also in 1 Chronicles 6 and 74. But in First Chronicles, it's called Mashal. It's spelled a little bit. It's spelled a little bit different. And Abdon occurs among the towns which Asher also gave to the Levites. So that's talked about again in chapter 21, and then in First Chronicles, where it goes through all of this stuff. So we see a pattern here that the Levites are going to get at least 2 and sometimes 3 towns in each one of these areas. And now, that's significant because, the job of the Levites, they were the priests. So it was important that they had centers of worship for all of these different tribes to deal with. Now, this Carmel, which actually means fruit field, which was acquired and talked about a little bit in the history of Elijah in 1 Kings chapter 18, verse 17, is a wooded mountain range which stretches in a northwesterly direction on the southern side of Kishon and projects as a promontory into the sea. And its name, Fruit Field, is well chosen because the lower part is covered with laurel and olive trees, and there's a lot of fig trees and oaks, and the whole mountain is, from what I understand, full of a lot of wildflowers and stuff like that. It's the way I understand it, it's a very beautiful area, and it's a very fertile area, and there's a lot of things there for subsistence, and it's a good area also to have. And also, it's noted that there was a lot of caves in this particular area. So it was a nice place to be. You had seaside, and you had the mountains, and a lot of neat stuff for the people to live. And it's a pretty nice area. Comments about those verses. Okay, let's move on then to Naphtali and look at verses 32 through 39. And the 6th lot came out of the sons of Naphtali, and the sons of Naphtali according to their families. And you can read here about all the places that were their borders, but one of their borders were, of course, along the river Jordan. And the border turns a little bit west, and it goes out and about. You see them up in here is the area that we're talking about here, up in there. And the Sea of Galilee and the Jordan River is the north of that sea. It forms kind of like their eastern border, and it extended north to the Phoenician territory. Now, Naphtali shared borders on the west with Asher, on the southwest with Zebulun, and on the south with Issachar. And there were 19 fortified cities that belonged to this tribe. Now, obviously, this was an important area to defend because you had the Phoenicians up above there, and they weren't fans of the Israelites. So there was kind of peace between the two that wasn't very stable. So it would be interesting, or noted that these cities would be fortified. It's also kind of interesting to note that today, that's one of the areas where they're worried about in the Middle East, where these terrorists are going to come out of Lebanon. And this is the area that we're talking about, where the Israel Defense Force is kind of fortifying up in there to make sure that there's not an invasion from the north. And I mean, a lot of these areas that we're talking about today is the areas that are in the news right now. With the problems with with Hamas and all that bunch of nuts over there, running around. And I'm gonna tell you what, this is a pretty serious situation. This could be a situation if they come in out of Lebanon. United States is liable to do something. We're liable to have World War III start right over there in the Middle East. I think it could be that serious. So anyway, a lot of these fortified cities have not been completely identified, but a lot of them have. Now the tribe here failed to obey God's command to drive out all of the Canaanites living in their territory. So we've talked about this before. Anytime that they didn't do what God told them to do, it ended up with problems. So, there was a lot of Canaanites that lived among this tribe in the land. And later on, as time went on, it actually became a problem for them, even though we're told in Judges 1 and 33 that, they put a lot of these Canaanites into forced labor. But still, you had the intermingling, and they didn't do exactly the things that God wanted them to do. Comments about those verses. Okay, let's move on to the inheritance for Dan in verses 40 through 48. And Dan was the last tribe to receive its territorial inheritance. And in the Bible census of the book of Numbers, the tribe of Dan is portrayed as the second largest Israelite tribe after Judah. And probably one of the most celebrated Danites was Samson. And he came out of that particular area. So starting with verse 40, it says the seventh lot came out for the tribe and the sons of Dan according to their families. And we can see they're up. They're up in here. No, they're right here. There they are. There's the area that we're talking about. So this land that was originally allotted to Dan was a small enclave in the central coast area of Canaan between Judah, Benjamin, Ephraim, and the Philistines. So Dan received the territory primarily in the coastal plain west of Benjamin, and it was between Judah and Ephraim. And again, even though it's a small section, it was a very fruitful and fertile land to inherit. And the territory, which is not extensive originally, was soon diminished by the tribe abandoned hopes of settling near the central coast. Instead, they migrated north of the Philistine territory, and they conquered the area of Liddish and the city of Dan. And this is talked about in Judges, the 18th chapter. Now, the Amorites who settled a portion of the Philistine plain, this is talked about in Judges 1 and 34, drove the Danites out of the plain and into the hills. And the tribe was only able to camp in the hill country that was overlooking the Sorek Valley. And the camp location became known as the Camp of Dan. So they didn't manage their area very well that they had. They didn't do the things that God wanted them to do, and they had a lot of bad neighbors. And apparently they weren't very good warriors, because they got pushed around quite a bit by some of the other groups. So this led the migration of part of the tribe of Dan northward to Leshem in the northern part of Napoli. And this is this is talked about in Judges, the 17th and 18th chapter. Now, Dan did possess 19 towns, which is talked about here in verses 41 through 47. And the record of the conquest of Lisham also called Laish and later Dan in Judges 18, which talks about all this type of thing. So, up to this point, all of the different tribes have got their inheritance that they're having to deal with. So now we're coming to the point in verses 49 and 50. Joshua is going to get his part. Now, let's read this here real quick, and I'm going to make some comments. It says, when they had made an end of dividing the land for an inheritance by their borders, the sons of Israel gave an inheritance to Joshua, the son of Nun, among them. According to the command of Jehovah, they gave him the city which he asked, Tamashirah in the Mount Ephraim, and he built the city and lived in it. So, the they here that's being talked about is Eleazar and Joshua and the 10 men that were appointed for the purpose of doing the tribes here. So all of the lots have been drawn, and all of the inheritance had been divided up among the families. And we see here that, like the good leader that Joshua was, he made sure that everybody else was taken care of before himself. And that's what a good leader does. He makes sure these people's taken care of, and then he takes care of himself. We also see here that he didn't ask for anything. He didn't make any demands, and there's no question about it that he deserved to get anything that he wanted. But he didn't ask about it. But God was not going to let him go unrewarded in this deal. We see the providence here that the people got together and said, okay, here is what we are going to give Joshua. And I think, from a providence standpoint, they knew the area that he would like to have. And I'm sure he probably along the line made it known that, that he really liked this area or something along that line, that they knew that this was the area that he wanted. So they made sure that he got the things that he wanted as a reward for the things that he had done. So it was absolutely appropriate that the great leader that Joshua was, that he would receive an inheritance that was suited to his dignity and as a reward for all of the things that he had done for the children of Israel. And we got to remember, this is pretty much near the end of his life. And he still had to go in and do some things to prepare the cities and things along this line. And God took care of the things that that needed to be done, because this was done according to the word of the Lord. The Lord played a key role in this deal. And we also see here that he chose a place that was inside of the area that was allotted to his tribe, but and he really didn't get the best place of all, but he got a pretty good place. It was kind of up in the mountains and kind of a place where he could get away and nobody could bother him. So he had received but a small inheritance in the promised land, but it was just what he wanted, because his good inheritance was going to be with God in eternity. So as Caleb had received something for his faithful service, we see here that Joshua also received something for his faithful service, and the reward came at the end of his life. But the reward, not only a reward in heaven, but he also got a reward here on this earth for all the things that he had done. So we're going to finish this up before Keith gets up with verse 51. And these are the inheritance which Eleazar the priest and Joshua the son of Nun and the heads of the fathers of the tribes of the sons of Israel divided for an inheritance by lot in Shiloh before Jehovah at the door of the tabernacle of the congregation, and they finished dividing the land. So here we have finished finally Israel going to the promised land being divided up, and then we're going to start another section in verse 20 talking about some other things that need to be done. So I appreciate everybody's attention and comments today.